Good evening, everyone. I believe we are now live. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, students. My name is Luisa Białasiewicz, and I'm Professor of European Governance at the University of Amsterdam. And on behalf of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, I would like to welcome you to tonight's discussion that we are organizing in collaboration with SPOW25. And a huge thank you goes to our colleagues at SPOW for bearing with us through the various stages of this event and its various iterations, we should say, since last April, when we first hoped to hold this discussion in physical form. But here we are finally tonight, and although we are not able to hold the event in person, I very much hope that we can offer you an engaging evening of discussion, nevertheless, on a set of questions that are still very timely and very relevant. And judging by the number of registrations we had for the event, it very much appears so. So for myself as a political geographer, whose own research actually focuses predominantly on Mediterranean geopolitics, the 2011 intervention in Libya marked a very important watershed. In many ways, in fact, it was the first instance in which the responsibility to protect was explicitly invoked by the international community in order to justify the intervention. But it was also a very important testing ground for a kind of nascent EU geopolitical vision and EU engagement in the region, a vision that, let's say, it's still in the process of elaboration, still very conflicted, as events in the Eastern Mediterranean show, but very much a kind of important passage point for the birth also of that vision. So we're extremely fortunate to have with us tonight someone who has examined that 2011 intervention in great detail, and who will share her insights with us, both on that intervention's background as well as its enduring effects. Dr. Karin Wester has worked for the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs for over 20 years now in a variety of capacities, working on all sorts of issues from multilateral collaboration to human rights, peace and security questions. And she's currently the ministry's strategic policy advisor for the Middle East and North Africa. Tonight, she will present us the main findings of her book that was just recently published this spring, in fact, by Cambridge University Press. The title of that volume is very much the title of tonight's evening, Intervention in Libya, the Responsibility to Protect in North Africa. And the book, I can tell you, I had the pleasure of reading it this spring. It's really a unique analysis in many ways of that intervention, because it brings together not just a kind of historical background, it discusses kind of the longer histories of that crisis, but also direct engagement with some of its main protagonists, including interviews with key diplomats and key political figures. So it really provides the kind of deep context to what happened in those fateful months. So tonight, Karin is going to share with us the main findings of the book, focusing on a couple of things, focusing on the international response and specifically the ways in which the responsibility to protect was invoked and implemented, and some of the lessons that the EU could or should perhaps learn from that crisis. For those of you who would like to get a copy of the book, you should have received with your Zoom invitation a link to an order form and a discount code. And thanks to Cambridge University Press for making that possible. Joining Karin tonight, we're very fortunate to also have two discussants who are exceptionally well positioned to comment on both the book and the events of 2011 and their aftermath. So Tarek Megarisi is a policy fellow at the European Council for Foreign Relations and certainly one of Europe's leading experts on Libyan affairs. He's written extensively, both on the aftermath of the intervention, but also on current developments in Libya. and the wider region as well. And I always follow his pieces with great interest. Our second commentator tonight is His Excellency Gerard Steegs. He's currently the director of the Department of Multilateral Organizations and Human Rights in the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But also very importantly, Gerard served as the ambassador of the Netherlands to Libya in that moment. So he was the ambassador there from 2010 to 2012, and subsequently ambassador to Egypt and special envoy to Syria. So also somebody who's extremely well positioned to comment not just on the events of 2011, but also on their impact on the wider region. So thank you so much to both of you for taking time out of your undoubtedly busy schedules to be with us tonight and to take part in the discussion. Just one last word from me about the structure of the event tonight. I will now pass the floor to Karin, who will start with a brief introduction to the book and to its main takeaways. Following that, we'll give the floor to our two discussants, who will speak for somewhere between 8 to 10 minutes each. We will let Karin respond to them in turn. And then following that, we will open the floor to you in the audience for what undoubtedly will be a very interesting Q&A session. And for those not familiar with the webinar seminars that SPOW has been hosting, you will see a Q&A button on your screen where you can submit your questions, and you can specify one of the panelists who you would like to direct your question to, or just submit them generally. All right, without further ado then, Karin, the floor is yours, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Louisa, for this kind introduction. And I would like to say to everyone who has joined us tonight, a warm welcome. Unfortunately, I cannot see you, and we all had very much preferred to organize this presentation and panel discussion in a different format with physical presence in the room, which is also why we kept postponing it, hoping that that would still be possible. But ultimately, we have reconciled ourselves with this digital format, since we simply didn't have any other choice. So welcome. Thanks for joining. Many thanks to SPOW 25 for organizing this, to the American Amsterdam Center for European Studies, Louisa, and also to the two panelists who stuck with us throughout this entire process. So I would like to start by saying that today Libya is mostly in the news as a war-torn country, a stronghold for terrorism, a transit country for migrants held in appalling conditions, and an international battleground where regional and international players compete for power and influence. But today, I would like to take you back to the events of 2011, the Libyan uprising, the international response, and some of the lessons we can learn from this. The title of my book, as Louisa already said, is Intervention in Libya, the Responsibility to Protect in North Africa. Now, a couple of words about the responsibility to protect first. It is a relatively new principle, which was adopted in 2005 by heads of states at the United Nations. It stipulates that each state has the responsibility to protect its populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. And importantly, that the international community has a complementary responsibility to this end through the United Nations. If peaceful means are inadequate and national authorities are manifestly failing to protect their populations, the international community can take collective action based on Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. Now, what this means is that the responsibility to protect prioritizes human life over the primacy of state sovereignty. It endorses the use of military force against errant regimes in order to avert major humanitarian catastrophes, if the UN Security Council so decides. It builds on a trend we have seen after the end of the Cold War of an increasing number of interventions for humanitarian purposes, such as Somalia, Haiti, and Kosovo. A trend which has, of course, been inconsistent. Think, for instance, about Rwanda, Srebrenica, Darfur, and Congo. Now, the Libyan case is extremely important because it constitutes the first case in which the international community invoked the responsibility to protect in order to justify the use of collective force against the state in order to avert mass atrocities. So what I set out to do in this book was to analyze how the responsibility to protect has been implemented in Libya, what the impact has been, as well as the challenges and the shortcomings in delivering on the principle. In order to do so, I tried to carefully reconstruct and analyze how the uprising in Libya evolved and how the international response developed. In capitals, in corridors of the United Nations, meetings of regional organizations, and strategic and operational headquarters of Nato. In addition to studying literature and primary resources, I also conducted many in-depth interviews with key players involved in New York, Brussels, The Hague, Amsterdam, and Tripoli. They included politicians, diplomats, staff of international organizations, scholars, and NGO representatives. I personally found these interviews of invaluable importance in order to properly understand the events of 2011 as they evolved. Let me now share a few of the main findings of the book. And of course, for the entire account of all the events, I would like to refer to the book, and it's been so complex to reconstruct it that I wouldn't even try to summarize that all here tonight. But I would like to focus on a number of topics which I find particularly relevant myself, and which may correct some myths or narratives that have emerged over the years about the uprising in Libya and about the intervention. First of all, the nature of the Libyan revolution. And I hope that Tarek will also be able to comment on this later on, because I think he basically lived it at the time. But my study exemplifies that the revolution in Libya was really started by Libyan citizens who were emboldened by previous revolts in Tunisia and Egypt, and driven by pent-up anger and resentment over years of suppression. I would like to emphasize this here, since over the years, sometimes we seem to have forgotten that this uprising was a homegrown process, and that the calls for change and for international support originated from the Libyan people themselves. I've spoken to a lot of Libyans, and I was very impressed with what they told me. One of the things was that they said there was barely a family in Libya who was not affected by almost 4 decades of the rule of Gaddafi and all the atrocities that went on in that time. They also told me how much courage it took to break the shackles of fear, since everyone in Libya knew that the response of the regime would be ruthless. And this is exactly what happened. As the originally peaceful demonstrations spread throughout the country, the Libyan regime responded with excessive and indiscriminate violence against unarmed protesters. And this was later on also documented in great detail by the Commission of Inquiry established by the UN Human Rights Council. Now, secondly, I would like to focus on the nature of the international response, especially the decisions of the UN Security Council in February and March 2011. In the case of Libya, the Security Council responded to what was happening in an unprecedented way, with exceptional speed and remarkable unity. and provided a legal mandate for military intervention. As soon as February 26, so that was barely 10 days after the uprising started, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 9070, imposing an arms embargo, travel ban and asset freeze, and referring the case of Libya to the International Criminal Court. Less than 3 weeks later, on March 17, the Security Council adopted Resolution 9073, authorizing the establishment of a no-fly zone and the use of military force in order to protect civilians. Now, I would like to stress that this is not the speed and the decisiveness with which the Security Council normally works. It was exceptional. And there were specific conditions that had a significant impact on this decisive response of the international community. First of all, over the prior 4 decades, Gaddafi had alienated himself from the lion's share of the international community. Regional organizations as the Arab League, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the organizations of the Islamic State even took the lead in calling for forceful action against him. Also, Gaddafi and his son Said repeatedly came out in public to voice explicit horrific threats against the civilian population, to cleanse Libya inch by inch, house by house, alley by alley of insurgent vermin, amongst others. Thirdly, the opposition in Libya and outside of Libya was organized in a very specific way. The opposition included the Libyan diaspora living in exile, and very importantly, regime defectors from high ranks in the army, government, and diplomacy, with deep experience and legitimacy in international and UN circles. A number of them condemned and defected from the Gaddafi regime early on and at a significant personal risk. And one of those persons was, very importantly, the deputy ambassador of Libya to the United Nations in New York, Ibrahim Dabashi. On the 21st of February, so that was very early on, he took the decisive step to say, okay, I step away from the regime and I defect the authorities that he had been serving, I think, for almost 30 years as a career diplomat. And I had the honor to interview him on this decisive and also for himself risky step. And that was very impressive because during that, I had a very long interview with him. And he explained to me that also his own family had been personally affected, and there had been victims of the Gaddafi regime in his own family, which he had tried to swallow for years and years. But when the time came in February 2011, he finally decided to just stop and say, this is enough, not any further. He was a very important person in the process in New York because as people who work there know, you work very closely together. And if someone who's been serving there for a number of years in his mission to the United Nations takes this decisive step, it's very meaningful. So he had a lot of impact on the subsequent decisions that were being made by the Security Council. The fourth factor that I would like to mention that was of a decisive importance for the Security Council decisions taken in that period was that a number of individuals who had an essential impact on the decision-making process were favorably inclined to an intervention for humanitarian reasons. And one of them was, of course, President Sarkozy. And the other person was ultimately President Obama as well, amongst others. And then there were also persons who chose not to prevent this decision. And a very important one was the Russian President Medvedev at the time, because the second Security Council resolution I mentioned, 1973, was not supported by China and by Russia, but what was very important is that they also decided not to veto it. I would like to emphasize, in summarizing this, how extraordinary this alignment of conditions was in the spring of 2011, and hence how difficult it actually is to build the international consensus to enforce the responsibility to protect with military action. So I think it's very fair to say that we won't see this happening anytime again soon, especially not in the current geopolitical situation. Now I would like to move on to the third issue I would like to focus on, and that is the question of ulterior motives for the international response or for the intervention itself. A reconstruction of the decision-making processes leading to the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1973 shows that to a certain extent, political and economic interests at play informed the decisions of the states on the Security Council. The need to provide a politically desirable response to the Arab Spring, the fact that Gaddafi was a highly erratic leader who had many enemies, embarrassment over past bonds forged with the Libyan leader, and geopolitical and commercial interests in Libya were all weighted besides the humanitarian concerns. But ultimately, what I've been able to conclude based on all the sources I studied and people I spoke to is that the reports of the atrocities being committed in Libya and the public response to these reports informed the position of the states in the Security Council to a significant degree. The decision-making process within the US administration shows, for example, that ultimately President Obama was largely guided by the principles of the just war he had advocated in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech in December 2009. In addition, I would like to add, I have not seen any compelling argument as to why Western countries would have wanted to use military force at this particular point in time in order to invade Libya or effect regime change. Libya had been an international pariah state in the 1990s, but around the turn of the century, a series of back-channel negotiations between Libya and primarily the United Kingdom and the United States had resulted in a number of agreements on financial compensation for Lockerbie victims, Libya's renunciation of terrorism, and the country's denouncement of its weapons of mass destruction program. In that process, Libya was transformed into one of the main collaborators of Western powers in the war against terror, which unfortunately included cooperation in the cases of rendition. After UN, EU, and US sanctions had finally been lifted by the beginning of the 21st century, many Western states, also others, and companies had been very quick to develop collaboration with the country in a wide variety of areas: economic, political, security. And Libya was, at least on the face of it, fully rehabilitated on the world stage. So what I'm trying to say is that if you look purely at the economic or political interest of Western states and others, it would actually run counter to their interest to intervene. It would have been a decision, it was a decision that wasn't in their best interest given the situation in 2011. The fourth issue I want to touch upon here is, was the intervention a premeditated attempt on the part of the intervening states or NATO to affect regime change? And this, of course, is linked to the question I previously addressed. Now, I would like to say that France, the UK, and the United States originally begun with the military operation called Operation Odyssey Dawn on 19 March. However, I think that hasn't been so widely published, but they faced considerable difficulties amongst each other, as well as with other NATO allies and coalition forces, in agreeing on the future direction of the operation in Libya. Only after intense diplomatic efforts was a compromise reached. And by the end of March, NATO decided to take over command and control of all operations in Libya, including the protection of civilians. However, as has transpired from my interviews, but later on this has also been covered extensively by people who were actually involved in the planning and execution of the NATO intervention, such as General Rob Wayhill, who wrote a book about this. NATO was quite poorly prepared for this intervention in terms of capabilities it had available, planning, and intelligence. And the Security Council's authorization to take all necessary measures to protect civilians provided NATO, and more specifically the military staff, with a very broad mandate, but also with very difficult operational questions that at times they could barely respond to and integrate in their operations. In addition, the operation lasted much longer than originally foreseen. The mandate for the operation had to be extended twice. And on the question of regime change, I have been told, and that's also covered in other places, that on the NATO premises, whether it was planning or whether it was in the operational headquarters, the term regime change was not even allowed to be used. And if it was used, people were expelled from the properties. Now, in and of itself, that is perhaps not as convincing as the previous points I've mentioned, but I have not found any evidence that this was a premeditated NATO regime change operation. Actually, quite the opposite. Also, in this context, I would like to stress that until the summer of 2011, intense diplomatic efforts were made by coalition states, as well as by states such as Turkey, Russia, and by the African Union, to broker a political solution to the crisis and to convince Gaddafi to negotiate, compromise, leave the country, etc. But throughout the process, he was entirely unwilling to take any step in that direction. Gaddafi, I read, he said in a speech that he made back in the 70s at a university in Libya, he said literally, "I found this country in ruins and I will leave it in ruins." And throughout the uprising and the subsequent intervention in 2011, he repeatedly said, "I will fight until the last drop of blood has been spent." And ultimately, that is exactly what he did. Now, after having addressed a number of those main issues regarding the events of 2011, I would now like to briefly share a few conclusions I've drawn in my book on the international response to the Libyan crisis and the responsibility to protect. I believe that the political moral imperative comprised by the responsibility to protect, which led to the Security Council decision to authorize the use of force in order to protect civilians, most likely did avert mass atrocities, especially in the city of Benghazi in March 2011. However, the case of Libya has also demonstrated that the responsibility to protect provides a very fragile basis for military enforcement action by international actors without host state consent. The problem is that a number of crucial questions regarding the implementation of the principle remain essentially unresolved. When can a regime be considered capable of providing protection to its people? And when is it manifestly failing? In other words, what exactly is the threshold to intervene? When have peaceful diplomatic efforts to address a regime's misbehavior been sufficiently exhausted? And there's been a lot of discussions about that in the case of Libya, especially regarding the efforts of the African Union in this respect. Exactly when, how, and by whom should collective military action be taken? Does coercive action in order to protect populations justify targeting the source from which the threat is emanating or supporting opposition groups? How does the intervening force relate to local actors claiming legitimacy and authority? All these essential questions remain unresolved by the responsibility to protect as currently defined. As a result, in the case of Libya, all decisions on the nature of the so-called necessary measures taken, their desired effect, and their duration were essentially left to the intervening powers. And it should be noted, to a considerable extent to their military leaders. This predictably created a vast legitimacy vacuum within the international community, which may lead one to conclude that the intervention in Libya may have been legal, but lacked sufficient legitimacy. In addition, the Libyan case has demonstrated that a number of profound problems complicate the use of military force for protective purposes without host state consent. First, and I'll be very brief here, if there are questions afterwards, I'm happy to answer them. First, the fragmented nature of the international community is likely to become apparent during enforcement action, which incapacitates the United Nations to a considerable degree. And we have seen that very clearly during the actual intervention phase in Libya, that it was very hard for the United Nations and the special envoy to have a real impact on what was happening. Later on, by the end of the year, that was reverted a little bit, but in that specific time, in that process, I think the UN could do very little and was a decisive actor. Secondly, the Libyan case has exemplified the absence of a sufficiently transparent and accountable collective security arrangement capable of taking military action in order to protect civilians in high-intensity, fast-moving armed conflicts. What I mean with that is that what we see here is that the Security Council is the body that can authorize military enforcement action and is actually also tasked with that under the responsibility to protect, but it lacks the resources to implement its own mandate because the UN doesn't have a standing force. That means that it has to rely for this on regional arrangements or coalitions of the willing. In this case, it was so-called outsourced to Nato, but Nato is a collective self-defense organization that doesn't work under the supervision of the Security Council and therefore cannot be held accountable for its actions by the Security Council that has authorized them in the first place. And that created a lot of tensions. And I think that's also part of the reason why countries like Russia and China were so vocally opposed to what was happening, because the Security Council during the actual intervention stage was mostly sidelined. Third, important also, there is a lack of understanding and by extension a lack of consent that some of the bedrock principles employed by the United Nations, such as host state consent, neutrality, and impartiality, may have to be abandoned if military force is used in order to implement a responsibility to protect. And finally, the case of Libya has demonstrated that military intervention in order to protect populations without the appropriate international approach in the previous period as well as the necessary assistance afterwards, is essentially ill-conceived and may be counterproductive. And I think in the follow-up discussion, we might mostly touch upon this last point, because in the post-conflict phase, I think is where a lot of decisions, personally, I think could have been made very differently, and then we might have been in a different situation right now. But we will address that question later on, and I'm sure that Tarek also has a number of very important things to say about that. I would like to conclude now by saying that my heart goes out to the people of Libya, who have suffered tremendously already in the course of the entire last century. I believe personally that there was a window of opportunity back in 2012 and 2013 for the Libyans to determine their own future and to take matters in their own hand with some proper international support. But that window closed very rapidly. And ever since, it has been a never-ending cycle of violence and conflict, to a large extent also caused by external actors. It is a tragedy for all of those who made such huge sacrifices back in 2011 and beyond. The Libyans have not been able to truly benefit from their own revolution. In my view, this is the real predicament that we have to face, and that we hopefully at some point will be able to redress. Thank you, Louisa.
Thank you very much, Karin, also for attempting to synthesize a very complex and complicated argument that you make in your book, and also a history of this intervention, which, as you note, was plagued from the start by a variety of challenges, both within Libya and certainly in the international coalition that came together. And I think that, the really kind of the important, I think, set of questions has to do precisely with both the kind of the realm of possibility that was there, but also the inescapable limitations of any intervention of this sort. But I'll pause here, and I'd like to pass the floor to our first discussant of the evening, to Tarek Megarisi, to hear your response and your thoughts to Karin's presentation. Tarek, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Louisa, and thank you all for having me here this evening. That was a great introduction by Karin, a very comprehensive one, and I'm going to I'll try my best at least to add to it by, oh, sorry, I realized my camera wasn't working. I'll try my best to add to it by kind of looking at the day after scenario and perhaps what might have been different, how things could have been different, both for the continued deployment of R2P and for Libya and its transition and its intervention. But just to start, one point which I really struggled to kind of move beyond or to shake as I read through the book was that the opening segment on right to protect is this kind of steady progression of right to protect as a principle in law and multilateral politics and within the UN, which is brilliantly documented, I should say, but it's like a genuinely positive story, which is so rare in this hyper cynical world of international relations that we all inhabit and usually work with. And then it all kind of just went the way it did, and it's had its credibility, so completely shot. Because the Libyan transition failed. But that's kind of unrelated to R2P and its deployment here, because it was actually quite a successful intervention, if you look at it, on its own merits and in isolation. And, as Karin laid out quite well, I don't really buy some of these counterfactuals that, the intervention was all fabricated and too highly politicized, and, Gaddafi was not going to do what he said he would do. And I'd actually, kind of in an ironic way, like to use something that Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, often says, that, the NATO intervention was the difference between Libya and Syria. Now, of course, he means this in this hyper-ironic gaslighting way of suggesting that the situation in Syria is better than Libya. But even today, after 9 years of civil war, the situation in Libya is better than Syria by every metric possible. And if we then want to limit our frame of reference to the uprising itself and how NATO intervened because of R2P, and just to look at that, then the two stories are not just worlds apart, they're galaxies apart. Where Libya failed and fell down was kind of from the day after. And I think, Karin, you were right to put right at the front and center of the lessons learned paragraphs towards the end, this reminder that, these things, R2P's deployment, the intervention and so on, they don't happen in isolation. And they're not things that are implemented, within the cold black and white world of the law, but, they're implemented in the world of politics, which is painted with infinite shades of gray. And in this case, I think it's the unchecked way in which later on in the story and in the intervention, the politics of the situation cynically used, and in some cases just overrode the principle of R2P, resulted in the detriment, to both the future use of this principle and Libya's own revolutionary story. Being able to use R2P for the Libya intervention, as Karin outlined, was a massive coup. And it is the culmination of kind of a really long trail. And it was a new position and an accomplishment that should have been shielded and protected. But the way in which the intervention that was triggered by R2P became about regime change, and the kind of how that transition happened with only very meek and perfunctory checks and balances in the way, gave states like Russia and China all the fuel they would ever need to denigrate R2P going forwards, which is what Mr. Lavrov is doing every single time he calls out Libya as a Western failure. Because R2P at this stage in its evolution was always, frankly, going to scare the bejesus out of many states and many dictators around the world. And the counter push to R2P's first deployment probably should have been anticipated and mitigated against by its champions. But given that it was regime change, this aspect, which is often the primary means used to denigrate R2P and Libya as, cynical and political and so on, it also poses quite an interesting question about, what protecting really means in these contexts. I mean, is it solely just the right to match aggressive violence with defensive violence and kind of this perfect counterbalance and absolutely nothing more? And how would that even work in reality? Or would it just eventually kind of result in infinite deployments holding up infinite shields over different vulnerable groups all over the world? And there is a solid argument to be made to say that, seeing R2P through in the Libyan context kind of necessitated regime change. But that debate was never really had because, both by the Libyans on the ground and by some of the intervening NATO states, the need for regime change became political somewhere during the war. And if we just explore this kind of counterfactual for a minute, it's worth understanding the degree to which NATO's intervention changed the revolution. The moment that NATO got involved was the moment that the revolution and Libya's revolutionaries, they kind of shed the hesitance of David versus Goliath, and they assumed the arrogance of Goliath facing down David. And that meant that there was no willingness to find compromise, to talk. And that was also quite evident with how the African Union's own mediating initiative was so readily dismissed. Now, even in this world of the counterfactual, knowing what I know about Gaddafi, I don't think he would ever have given up his throne, his crown to a managed transition. And some of the quotes that Karin used really laid out that idea clearly. But I think the act of having, for the revolutionaries of having to form negotiating groups and having to deal with Gaddafi's other supporters and just having those discussions, what I think have forced Libyans involved on both sides of the divide to think about the situation they were in new ways. And it could have ended up creating new ideas for the political transition. And whether this would have then resulted in a successful transition is kind of anyone's guess. But I think it would have certainly dampened the winner takes all mentality, to the victim goes as spoils and so on, that did really a lot of damage to the post-revolutionary social fabric of Libya and the Libyan transition. So, when we talk about protect, okay, of course, we talk about using military might to shield the vulnerable, but we should also really be talking about using that umbrella that is put up to then also explore ways to kind of unearth and unwind forms of embedded violence and the structures of violence that are there and present, and that will ensure that, you know, these kind of atrocities will keep happening long after the initial intervention takes place. And this, once again, it kind of raises an awkward question of how much are we, and I say we as that kind of amorphous blob known as the international community, willing to do to provide to someone else's problem, and how long are we willing to do that for? And just to kind of build on this point of saying that R2P perhaps should be about more than reminding violent abusers that there is always somebody capable of greater violence. You know, R2P shouldn't just be something examined and actualized by the lawyers, but here I think the, you know, the officials, the administrators, the civil servants at UN or multilateral level should anticipate these problems, and, you know, they could work to append to the principle of R2P and its operational notes the notion of deploying a package, because violence is not a one-off. You know, violence leaves scars, and there are different tools and methods needed to deal with the different forms of abuse that have been leveled in any particular context. And I think even having, you know, if there was an established awareness that these are long-term traumas that we're working to unwind and deal with, rather than just a simple showdown, would be something that's invaluable to have as kind of established and accepted wisdom that lives at the back of the mind of the diplomats at the Security Council. And Libya is another great example of this, because, you know, as soon as the war was done, as soon as the tyrant was dead, Libya was moved to an agenda item 10 at the United Nations Security Council, which meant that the subsequent UN mission to Libya became a support mission, which meant that it required Libyan approval or formal requests for support from Libya for this mission to really be capable of doing anything. But, you know, any quick assessment of the situation would have showed us that Libya's revolutionaries were not united, that before the war even ended, they were fighting each other. And perhaps the bigger problem was that Libyans were struggling to articulate what they saw as coming next, you know, what they all wanted and what should come next. A revolution, you know, kind of by its definition, it necessitates a change in system. But all we've really seen from those early days until today are just different versions of Gaddafi's governing system, which is, you know, this highly chaotic and competitive system of divide and conquer, just with different people and groups trying to replace Gaddafi. And this is why Libya is trapped in a cycle of fragmentation, and sometimes even having civil wars within civil wars. Because, you know, after 42 years of rule, Gaddafi hadn't just given Libya a system, he had created the entire framework, you know, the lens through which most Libyans see the concept of the state and understand it and perceive how it should function. So, you know, as we've seen over the course of two elected bodies, that even elected officials in Libya, for the most part, don't really have any idea of what it means to serve their constituency or to represent their constituency. They are, in essence, elected dictators, regardless of how few votes they've gotten. And they pay very little attention to governing, because they perceive political positions as just platforms to build out patronage networks. And not to, you know, get too distracted into the Libyan context, but the point behind all of this was just to say that, you know, if the same urgency and importance had been given to delivering political support, to, you know, meaningful conflict resolution and transitional justice programs, and empowering the international community to continue protecting in the broader sense of the term, and, you know, doing so in a prescriptive manner, then I think the transition could have been very different, you know, from the very early decisions taken by the first transitional bodies to kind of formalize militias after the war, to even later ones a few years down the line of these kind of very cynical uses of political office, and lustration laws, and so on and so forth. You know, as Karin pointed out, those first 2 years were a really valuable lesson, where people's understanding of what post-Gaddafi Libya is like is going to be shaped by. And we should have paid as much attention to the day after as to the day itself. And perhaps if that had been the case, then both Libya and the principle of right to protect would have been held in much greater esteem going forward, and would have been much more successful for it. On that note, I'll hand it back. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, Tarek, and thank you also for getting us to think about these issues, not just what protection means or what it should mean, also in terms of time. So not just in the moment, but also the very important question I think Karin raises multiple times in her book of what comes after, but also kind of thinking about these interventions happen in particular context, and we cannot ignore that. And I think it's important that you mentioned the 42 years of Gaddafi's rule. And the context that he left behind. But I'll stop here because I'd like to pass the floor to Gerard to give us his comments on the book and also on what has been said so far. Gerard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And let me first of all thank all of you for organizing this, Karin for having written a wonderful book, and Tarek for giving us his very knowledgeable comments. So thank you for all of that. I'll try to do justice to your company. When I was nominated as ambassador to Tripoli, I remember that my predecessor told me, are you sure you have a hobby? Because you'll need it. Well, so much for that. I was not even there for 2 months when things started to go in a completely different direction than people had foreseen. On February 17, the day of rage. And make no mistake, every diplomat that I frequented in Tripoli at that time was telling me, this man, Gaddafi, he's so bloody minded. People in Libya will not dare to revolt. It may happen in Tunisia, it may happen in Egypt, it may happen elsewhere, but people will be too afraid. So if you want any proof about the courage and the genuine heartfelt fervor of the Lebanese or the Libyan people to stand up against Gaddafi, there it is. I mean, nobody from the outside would have even believed that they would be able or willing to stand up, but they did, and with, well, consequences, some good, some bad, but on the whole, we cannot say that Libya is a very happy place today. Karin was mentioning the international community for once acting very fast and in unity. Yes, I would say, Karin, that is absolutely right. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had a resolution that enabled countries to assist the population of Libya in the R2P exercise that we've seen. But if you look closely, and you have done that, you also mentioned that in your book, 5 out of the 15 council members abstained when the resolution was voted. That already indicates very much that it was a very, very fragile unity that was 1 second in time there, and almost the very next moment, and you indeed refer to that, Karin, it was gone. That has hampered everything that happened afterwards in a way. So the omen was quite soon not very good. And what is the object of R2P? It's to protect the people. And R2P consists of actually 3 pillars. R2P is about preventing atrocities from happening. R2P is about reacting to atrocities as they are happening. And importantly, R2P is also about rebuilding after atrocities have stopped. Now, in Libya, we have seen that basically the second pillar has been employed. As it was happening, the international community reacted. But indeed, how do you react? It's a very important question. And the focus of the protection should be, of course, the people. And I think in the beginning, there's a lot of things been said about that already. What was the objective of the intervention? I think the objective was honestly to protect the people. But I remember the discussions that we had, diplomats among ourselves, that at a certain moment, that as the conflict was dragging on and as the protection was getting harder and more sustained, the necessity to do that work was more sustained. We were also coming to the realization that the biggest threat to the people of Libya was in fact Gaddafi. And I think that fed the notion that if you really want to protect the people, if you really want to act on the second pillar of R2P, you need to remove the biggest threat to the people, and that is Gaddafi. Now, that, of course, was not something that was in the books for countries like China and Russia. They would be loath to accept any kind of license to implement regime change. It's not on their international book. But it happened in that way, and they interpreted it in that way. And that also took care of their support forever after for at least the intervention type of R2P. The result of this intervention regime change, it resulted indeed in a chaotic situation. Once Gaddafi was removed, you were faced with a country that had no institutions whatsoever. There were loads of weapons everywhere. I can remember coming back after the nastiest part of the civil war. I came back to Tripoli in October, and you saw guys 16, 17 years old managing traffic with a Kalashnikov and a finger on the trigger. I mean, that was the kind of situation that was evolving. Security was very, very dire indeed. And don't think that we were not aware of the risk of what might happen if you remove Gaddafi from the equation. We were. I mean, everybody that we spoke to, everybody that I talked to while I was not in Tripoli, waiting for the opportunity to come back, was saying the first thing after Gaddafi is gone is to collect weapons. To collect weapons to make sure that gangs and whatever organizations will control weapons are not going to fight each other, criminalize, take leave with anything that would be proper state building, collect the weapons. But in order to do that, you have to be on the spot with a credible force. You have to risk, you have to stick out your neck. And I think that is where there was a singular unwillingness on the part of the countries that backed the intervention initially to put an actual force in place in Libya that would be able to start at least a transition by collecting weapons and by making a peaceful transition to an interim government. It's that unwillingness to have boots on the ground, and the boots on the ground, of course, the sort of well, what one would want to say, the allergy to boots on the ground, I think, has been building up ever since interventions in Bosnia, Afghanistan, Iraq. So that allergy was real and big. But it also took care of the possibility of managing a peaceful transition and having a force in place to collect weapons. So time and again, we have this conundrum. We have a moral imperative. We feel a moral imperative, sometimes mixed up with some more selfish reasons. Sometimes there are economic interests mixed in. But I think I like to believe, it's my part of the world, that we do very often want to intervene in these situations because we also feel a moral imperative. We want to stop the bad guy. But if you want to do that, you have to follow through. You should not get out when the going gets tough. And that is a bit what we have to face here also. I mean, if you indeed enter a situation as dire and as tricky as Libya, you have to think it through, and you have to be aware of the fact that it is going to get tough and you will have to stay the course in order to get out in a position where you have made things better. The problem is, how do you get from A to Z? How do you, together with the people of the country itself that want to change, that want a peaceful transition, how do you make that happen? Because the conditions initially are simply not there, and to work on the conditions being there will take time. And during that time, it will take resources, it will take facing risks, and it will take probably also a couple of derailings, but you have to stay the course and come back. We find that very, very difficult. What has happened now, I think, is that R2P and the three pillars is still around. It's still a concept that I encounter in my work as a director for multilateral affairs. But the main stress these days for R2P is on prevention. Prevention of atrocities by stepping in, by talking to a government that seems to be heading in the wrong direction, and by alerting worldwide others to the fact that some crisis might be brewing somewhere. I don't know whether this is a good future for R2P. I don't know whether it is the only future for R2P, but at least the concept is still there and we're still trying to make it work, however difficult it may be, but we're learning. I want to close off with broadening the picture a little bit. I've worked, as was said before, in Libya and after that in Egypt and not in Syria. If you have been around in the Arab world for a while, you will have more than once heard the complaint by counterparts, the West messed us up. The West interfered and they have done terrible things to us. And I think there is at least some evidence that supports that. We have indeed chosen very often between, as Kissinger says in his book, between legitimacy and stability. And we've chosen in the further away past, we've chosen time and again for stability, supporting dictators because they at least brought a stable regime to an unruly region. When we had a chance to choose legitimacy, when the Arab Spring revolution started happening, we found that legitimacy is a good cause, but a very complex and a very difficult one to make happen over a shorter period of time. It takes a longer period of dedicated cooperation with people in the region, with good-willing outside governments to make legitimacy work. That, unfortunately, is time that we've never seemed to be having. And that is, I think, still the biggest challenge that we see in the Middle East. I'm not a pessimist, so I'm not giving up on working together with those of goodwill in the region on a legitimate transition to better governments in the region. But I'm also quite aware that we have to do a lot of thinking and a lot of forward thinking to come up with an approach that might actually work better than what we've been able to do or trying to do in the past. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gerard, and thank you for those also at least partially optimistic words, because I was very much struck by the fact that both you and Tarek and Karin in part, kind of stressed this this question of time, of being willing to invest both the time, the resources, and the willingness, the commitment, which of course needs political will, it needs geopolitical will, and the question is who is willing to commit that, who is willing to follow through, as you were saying. Karin, before we open it up to the floor, and I see already some questions popping up, I was wondering if you wanted to add anything and indeed to respond to what both your discussants just said. So if I can pass the floor back to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Louisa, and many thanks as well to both panelists. And I think I could not have better panelists for this discussion, because they have shared a wealth of thought and experience, and I share almost everything that you've said, especially also on the post-intervention period and on how hard it is to get it right. In order to also leave a little bit of time for the questions, I'm going to respond very briefly. And the whole question of following through and how do we follow through after the actual intervention is a very complex one. Well, Tarek and Gerard have also already explained that. But if you, for instance, look at the resolution 1973, which provides the mandate to intervene in order to protect civilians, it's already stipulated right there that an occupation force has to be excluded. That was an important provision. And I have also reconstructed the process in the United Nations and at the UN Security Council by the time that the mandate that the Council provided, the authorization for the use of force, was ended, and that was actually the 31st of October 2011. And what you see in that period, in the weeks preceding that final decision, is that there is certainly no keenness on the part of international actors to continue to provide some form of military support there. But, however, NATO in an early stage did offer to continue to provide help with setting up a police force. NATO also behind the scenes had been working at that time to find broader ground with NGOs, with other international actors and the United Nations for a strategic plan to move forward after the actual intervention, but very little of this materialized. The impression is that a number of the states who took the lead in the actual intervention, the United States certainly was not keen to prolong its presence, nor were the European states. And that is something that, of course, later on President Obama has almost blamed them for when he said back in 2014 or 15 in an interview that he did not regret the intervention as such in Libya, but he did regret the fact that there was no more robust plan for the day after. And I think that the United States at that point saw that also primarily as a European responsibility, given that the intervention originated also very much from the initiative of European leaders. And of course, Northern Africa is also clearly close to Europe and a European interest. So I think, Tarek, when you say that there was no real interest, I think that is certainly true. No serious attempts were made, and they should have been made. But I would like to add, and that's also what I conclude based on a reconstruction of these processes in October 2011, that the Libyans themselves were also very reluctant and hesitant, and they were divided. You can clearly see that, and as you rightly said, of course, those divisions had already been shown also throughout the intervention, even though the opposition forces, they seemed united, they were not. But by the time that this final decision was taken to actually stop the authorization for the use of force, and also UNSMIL had been established at that point also by a Security Council resolution, the Libyans were very reluctant to, or actually they rejected the idea of having boots on the ground. And I remember not that long ago, I actually spoke with someone who was in those negotiations, a Libyan person who assisted the negotiators. And he said to me that when these discussions were going, they were partially in Arabic at the UN, and that one of the interpreters even asked for clarification when on the part of Libyans, it was said, no, we absolutely do not want any assistance with some sort of peacekeeping force or whatsoever on the ground in the country itself. Now, I think personally that was a huge mistake. I think something should have been done more than just the establishment of UNSMIL with a very light mandate. UNSMIL was established to support the Libyan authorities with their transition. But as far as I've understood, for instance, UNSMIL until the summer of 2012 did not have an expert in the field of security sector reform, which was of course one of the core things that was needed at that point. Also, if you take into consideration that by the end of 2011, according to estimates, there were in between 100 and 300 militias active in Libya. So in addition to what you have described so well, Tarek, after 40 years, the country was ruled by a ruler who basically worked against establishing any state institution. So everything had to be built. But on top of that, there was no monopoly on the use of force in the country whatsoever. And I think that was really, that problem was really underestimated. Not at first, because I think in 2012, there were, at first, things seemed to go in the right direction. That's what I mean, because there were elections organized with a very high turnout and work was being done on a constitution. Ultimately, I think that huge problem in the security sector may have been key of undermining all these processes. So therefore, I believe that back in 2011, the establishment of a peacekeeping force, one way or another, could have have a decisive impact on things for the better. And it's a shame that that was not decided, and it was partially unwillingness on all sides. Partially, I think it was also a form of naive optimism to some extent. If you look at what people said and the speeches, and also back in 2012, there were a lot of experts also who said, well, those huge missions with lasting footprints like in Afghanistan and Iraq, they don't work, but look at what the Libyans are doing. You know, they had elections, they're working on the constitution. So that was a time that there was still some optimism, but unfortunately that was not ultimately how things advanced. So I'll leave it at this, Louisa, so that we can also take a few questions. Thank you.
Absolutely. Before we turn to questions, I didn't know if Tarek or Gerard, you wanted to add anything to this. You know, kind of thinking of what could have happened. Even, you know, I guess I'm struck, Karin, by what you're saying is this kind of naivete of, well, you know, they can kind of somehow muddle through themselves. We don't want to get engaged. And you know, I guess the cynical part of my, you know, kind of political geography formation would say this, you know, this kind of naivete is very much informed by previous experiences, but also the unwillingness to fully commit. We kind of commit, but not fully, and certainly not commit in time. But Tarek, Gerard, I don't know if you want to add anything more to this. Yes, Gerard, go ahead.
Yeah, just about the situation that we found ourselves in just after the demise of Gaddafi. And indeed, as you said, Karin, there was no state, there were no ministries, there was no structure to fall back upon. So what happened immediately, actually, is that armed groups started doing governmental jobs of all sorts. And they were not unified. They were sometimes having fights with one another. Not exaggerating, I would usually fall asleep by the sound of gunfire, of something happening somewhere in Tripoli. So I don't think there was much optimism right at the beginning. The strange thing was that despite this horrible, insecure start of life without Gaddafi, if you want to call it that, at a certain moment, indeed, things seem to be moving in the right direction. But I think one factor that you have to mention here as well is that Libya is a country that could be paradise by the Mediterranean. I mean, it's huge. There's only 6 million people. It has beautiful beaches. It has wonderful agricultural lands in the east of the country, beautiful desert sites in the inland. So there's the natural resources, oil and gas, that can finance development. So there's, objectively speaking, every reason to think that one could make this wonderful country for those 6 million, 7 million by now, maybe people that live there. But I think the big thing is, and I once met a minister of finance from Morocco who said he was praying every morning, please don't let us find oil. You know, there is a lot of riches in Libya. And I think at a certain moment, all these armed groups were also waking up to the notion that if you could somehow grab the central state institutions or create the central state institutions, get on top of that income, get on top of the sovereign wealth fund and whatever was still left of it, then you would have amazing power and riches. That at a certain moment became also a factor in the development that happened afterwards. and it was not something that was beneficial. I'll leave it at that for now. So thanks.
Tarek, go ahead.
Thank you. I'll just add very quickly. I mean, I agree with everything that Karin was saying, and this is just the the various shades of grey that we live in the political world at play, and there's just the intersection of so many different dynamics. And the 31st of October wasn't just the day that the mission ended, but it was also the day that kind of us as the EU or the West, we stopped being proactive and we started being reactive. So even when these SSR programs that we talked about came into play, they were far too late down the road and incapable of dealing with the many variables at play by then, because the militias had been formalized. And we went to this place where overnight, as soon as people got a salary for being part of the militia, all of a sudden, there were like 4 or 5 times as many militiamen as ever fought in the war itself. And this brings quite an interesting dynamic, because new states are inherently fragile. And we were so worried about protecting Libya from what was inside Libya, we forgot to protect it from what was outside. And I think one of the biggest unspoken dynamics that affected Libya's transition was the very immediate attempts from other states of the region, from the Gulf especially, to try to subvert Libya's transition for their own gains. And it's not just Libya, but other states in the region, I think, to have this discussion amongst themselves about a new social contract, they need to be protected to do it. So perhaps boots on the ground, yes, absolutely wasn't the right response, especially given the Libyan atmosphere at the time. But perhaps to protect diplomatically from other states, or to deal with international issues such as the proliferation of weapons, because this, it fueled the insurgency in Mali, for example, could have been interesting ways and angles of approaching this problem.
Thank you very much for that, because I think, we've been touching upon what should have been done within, but I think there are indeed different scales of protection that should have been applied, both internally, but certainly, at the broader level of the region, but also from other actors who got involved, as you're saying, almost immediately. And we have a couple of questions pending, and one regarding the role of the EU, and I'll get to that in a second, but another question regarding the role of Russia and China in those early years. And Karin, you were mentioning this already in your introduction. Their very kind of strategic kind of positioning of allowing it to go forward, and yet delegitimizing the interventions. I think that's one question to ask, of what was that positioning of Russia and China and other actors that took a very important role in the years to come and still continue to do so, because in most, if you look at most discussions of what is happening in Libya right now, there's very little actually said about Libya. I mean, the focus is very much on who is, quote, calling the shots. And I think that's, that's something that I guess I would like you to comment on. And then I'll throw in this second question that's coming from our floor regarding the role of the EU. Tarek, I was struck that you said us as the West as the EU, which is of course not necessarily the same thing. Is this a missed opportunity for the EU? Karin, you were mentioning something that I think was quite clear in the immediate aftermath of the intervention, that certainly for the United States, this should have been a European problem that Europeans did not quite pick up. So I guess I would like to hear your comments on these two questions. So the role of other actors, Russia, China, but of course also all the other actors that are involved, but also on how this could have been an opportunity for the EU to exercise its geopolitical role in the region, and maybe, think of a different sort of intervention, maybe not with boots on the ground, but a different sort of post-conflict force. So I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Shall I start, Louisa? And I'm sure Tarek and Gerard.
Yes, please do. I think, these questions are to the three of you, so yes.
Well, the role of the EU, let me first point out that the role of the European Union back in 2011 was very limited indeed. And I have to say, maybe embarrassingly so, the EU at first, in the early months, in February and March, was mostly concerned about, first of all, bringing its own nationals back from Libya, as also other countries, of course, did when the conflict evolved. But secondly, the EU is very concerned about the number of refugees that might come from Libya across the Mediterranean to Europe. And that was a huge preoccupation, as you can also see in the reports of the meetings of the European councils of that period, which in my view is quite embarrassing. Also knowing already at the time that most refugees went to the neighboring countries, namely Egypt and Tunisia. Ultimately, the EU, at that point at least, I think received very few refugees. But the European Union, of course, spoke about it, and there were council conclusions, etc. But as far as I've been able to see, the impact of the Union in Libya itself, or in terms of the international intervention, was very limited. Maybe Gerard can correct it. He was in Tripoli at the time. Disappointingly so. So the states that were, the European states that were acting, were doing so as national states, not very much in the common, under the common European umbrella. You would think, Louisa, that now that strategic autonomy of the European Union is so much a focal point also of this current Commission, that indeed this would be the time to show some leadership also in the current situation in Libya. And I know that Tarek certainly has some interesting views on that he could share with us. But I think for sure Libya would be one of the countries towards the EU should be able to show its muscle if it wants to show that it has also strategic foreign autonomy. Secondly, briefly on the role of Russia and China. It's interesting to see that Russia and China, they abstained from that Security Council Resolution 1973, but they both knew very well what the implications would be of that resolution. And the day that the coalition, at that moment it was still a coalition, started to impose a no-fly zone and enforce the resolution with the use of military force, immediately that same day they came out condemning the use of force in Libya, which is also a way of them expressing their general opposition or rejection of foreign interference in other countries, which has always been, their basic policy. So part of that is following through with the lines they've always had, knowing full well that this is what they in so many ways authorized happening. Throughout the intervention, though, they were probably taken aback by how long the interventions lasted, how much force is being used, and they've expressed that in many different ways. Ultimately, though, Russia was very interesting, as I said, in I think it was in June or July, Russia maybe started to understand from which way the wind was blowing, but that's when they started also gradually to work with the Libya contact group on seeing how the conflict could be ended. And part of that was that Libya sent its chess champion to Tripoli to play chess with Gaddafi, and meanwhile pass on the message that the game was over, and in that way hoping that perhaps there would be a margin for some sort of political solution, but ultimately that didn't have any impact. So I'll leave it at that.
Gerard, Tarek, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, thank you. On Russia and China quickly, China is quite a funny one because it's often, bundled up with Russia, but China was actually quite heavily traumatized from Libya in 2011. They had built this really close partnership. They had, I think, almost 30,000 foreign workers there, and then all of a sudden they had to evacuate all of them, which was something very rare and new for China to do as a country. And the overwhelming impression is that they are still kind of traumatized from it. So they hesitantly look on. They don't want to overtly take sides and perhaps suffer for it whenever Libya does stabilize. But they learned their lessons from it. They've used Libya and the intervention that happened alongside Russia to kind of denigrate and bash R2P and Western interventionism. They've now developed a naval base of their own in Djibouti, partially off the back of the lessons from Libya. But really today it's Russia that's more involved. And Russia is kind of realizing this old adage that, chaos isn't a pit, it's a ladder. And they're trying to prolong this state of chaos in Libya in order to secure some of their interests with a relatively low outlay. And I think what Europe nor the EU has realized is how much of a strategic threat Libya can be, as well as how much of a boon a stable Libya can be. And the EU, if we look at it as an institution, especially a foreign policy institution, it's still relatively young, compared to the nation states that have been practicing foreign policy. And I don't think that there's the inbuilt awareness yet of when to flick between member state foreign policy and when a collective foreign policy is better and should be carried out through the EU. And I think that's partially why, as Karin was saying, the EU just wasn't really present until the security threats, of ISIS in Libya in 2015 and the migration threats came. And then all of a sudden it mobilized. But still, even today, we have different member states pulling in different directions. And I don't think the EU has really developed this ability yet to know when perhaps member states should rely on the HRVP and the EU to do some of its dirty work for it, in terms of sanctioning state spoilers and so on, and doing things that individual member states would prefer not to do because they don't want to damage bilateral relationships with other countries or other careful procedures that they're doing.
Herod, would you like to follow up?
Yeah, thanks. A lot of things have been said already. To just come back on some of it. China, indeed, I think Tarek is hitting the nail on the head, has been pretty much traumatized by what happened in 2011. They were about, if I'm not mistaken, they were about to sign off on a huge deal where they would lease a chunk of land and start a production zone, a free economic production zone of some sort. And they were ready to get invested big in Libya. I mean, they were seeing it as a prospect, a good location, resources available, lots of space. So they were getting ready to really go in a big way. And when things started to go haywire in 2011, it took them by surprise. And the first reflex they had was to save their people. That was really what it was all about. I remember indeed, as Tarek does, that this was a very big operation. I think Russia in 2011 was really not strategically positioned at all in Libya. That's why probably they let it go in the Security Council when it came to the vote on the resolution to allow R2P to be implemented, to be operationalized. The EU was a different animal. I mean, as a whole, I think the EU was not really that much aware of what was going on in Libya at all in 2011. The main thing, as was mentioned already, was about migration. Gaddafi has said at some stage that either you give me 2 billion or I open up the gates and you will be flooded with migrants from Africa. And that's the last thing you want. And believe me, I will do it. So he was really playing a very rough game on the migration issue with the EU, and the EU was aware of the fact that he was not totally bluffing. I mean, that there was indeed an importance to Libya as a transit country for migrants making their way to Europe. So the EU was invested in improving the border police, improving the Coast Guard, that sort of thing. I mean, this was ongoing EU action in 2011. The other thing, of course, was that some EU countries were very much invested in Libya. Italy, the first and foremost, of course. I mean, strangely enough, one might say, because they were a semi-colonial power in Libya, the third shore it was for a while for the Italians. They invested a lot during the Mussolini times, but that somehow carried over into the 21st century as well. They were still big time available, and some of the contacts that the Italian embassy had, nobody could match. There were some other countries in the EU that were getting interested economically in Libya. I mean, Tony Blair has been mentioned more than once in the sort of things going on. Sarkozy has been mentioned. A lot of people were sniffing around. And I think in 2011, just before everything happened, some of the major EU countries were getting ready to make what they call in German, Libya salonfähig, to sort of really start getting active. So when things went wrong, I think some of the countries were very keenly aware that this was not just any country, but that there was a lot of potential there. And I think that has driven some of the actions in 2011 as well. Also, the awareness that if you can somehow get out from this situation and create a transitional government and be the sugar daddy of that government, that it might be beneficial for the EU to be that sugar daddy. But the underestimation has been that despite all the advice of experts on how fragile and how dangerous the situation was, with so many weapons, so many groups having them, and so many oppositions internally, that it was not that easy to just create that transition without making your hands dirty. And the unwillingness to go that extra mile, to sit down with Libyan leaders and make a concrete plan on how you could make a peaceful transition out of the post-Gaddafi era, I think that has been the missed opportunity by and large. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much for that. And actually, thanks to the three of you for noting these points. And I think it's important to remember that, in fact, in those early months in the spring of 2011, the main preoccupation, was not even the violence that was taking place on the streets in Libyan cities, but the flood that Gaddafi was threatening. I mean, I remember, the commission issuing this warning sign that up to 1.5 million people could migrate. I mean, migration of biblical proportions, the Italian foreign minister announced at the time. So, think of, the narrative that accompanied the subsequent refugee crisis of 2015, 2016, I mean, those kind of apocalyptic predictions were already there. And indeed, as you all said, I mean, the only kind of concerted action seemed to be in the sphere of border control, not just on the part of the Italian authorities that had very close collaboration with Gaddafi already, but also on the part of other European states. So I think a question of why that sort of collaboration was not possible in state building, in kind of post-conflict support. But I think a lot of naivete, clearly, unwillingness perhaps, but also an underestimation, as all of you have hinted at. I'm conscious that we have already actually run out of time. There are various questions still hanging, but we will unfortunately have to call it a night. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you, Karin, for presenting us your book, and I encourage everybody to read it. I certainly learned a lot from it, and a very enjoyable and interesting read. Thank you very much to the discussants. Thank you, Tarek. Thank you, Gerard, for adding to this discussion also your contributions, which I'm hoping extended everybody's understanding of that situation and its effects today. So thanks so much. Thank you for our audience with sticking with us on this Thursday evening. To be continued. I mean, this is still a situation that will continue to evolve, as you're all saying, and we hope to see you again for future events as well. Thanks again.